You're talking about the economic frustration there to the price of gas now that is driving, as David and Sarah were just talking about, some of that economic fear and frustration being voiced in the new polling. The national average is now $4.06 a gallon. I'll play for you what President Trump said when pressed about what he's doing to actually lower prices.
All I have to do is leave Iran, and we'll be doing that very soon, and they'll become tumbling down.
He says that. However, most experts say that relief is not likely to be immediate, especially if the Strait of Hormuz remains largely paralyzed. CNN's Matt Egan is here with much more on that. What are you seeing? What are you hearing about this?
Well, Kate, clearly, as we just heard from David Chalian, $4 gas is a political problem for this White House. So it makes sense that officials are searching for an off-ramp. But energy industry experts that I'm talking to, they're surprised that this is the off-ramp that's being floated, right? Walking away from the Strait of Hormuz and letting someone else clean up that mess. Because, look, every single day, as we look at high gas prices, every single day, about 20% of what the world consumes in oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. At least that was the case before the war. It's just not sustainable to let it stay closed. And allowing Iran to stay in control, well, that's going to potentially be more expensive. And so analysts say, yeah, look, if the conflict ended, you could see a knee-jerk drop in prices, but not back to pre-war levels. And
well, it's also who defines what conflict ending is. Like, you can, U.S. warships can leave, but the strait could still be closed.
Exactly. You can end the war, but that doesn't necessarily end the energy crisis. Oil market veteran Dan Pickering, he told me it's a terrible idea to just walk away from the Strait of Hormuz because it would leave a very dangerous situation and investors would demand higher compensation. And look, the U.S. is not an island to itself in terms of energy. Every single day, the U.S. imports more than 6 million barrels of crude, almost 2 million barrels of gasoline, jet fuel, diesel, and other energy products. And even some former Trump officials think that this would be a bad idea. Take a listen to former Trump Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette on Fox Business yesterday.
The story, the Wall Street Journal story, is accurate, then I think it's highly problematic that we would leave that area without opening this strait. I mean, you think about this logically. If that were to happen, Iran gets exactly what it wants. It gets a ceasefire. It gets to keep this chokehold, and it looks more like a timeout rather than a deal.
Now, he went on to say that this would just punt the problem to future administrations. And look, that's why Dan Brouillette and some other...
That's like so unrealistic. You can't punt an energy crisis that we're in the midst of, a global energy...
Right, it's not sustainable. I mean, look at oil prices. You can't punt this
to another administration years out.
Right, we already saw last month a 51% increase in oil prices just in March, the second most since futures trading started back in the early 1980s. And look, I think the bottom line here is the last 5 weeks, it's been a reminder of how events on one side of the world can impact what all of us pay in terms of prices here in the U.S. And just walking away from the Strait of Hormuz, that risks unlearning that lesson.
Yeah, and it looks, when you look at the global oil markets, I mean, welcome to the roller coaster that we're going to be watching now.
Yeah.
And listening very closely to what the president says tonight.
Absolutely.
Good to see you. Thank you so much. JB.
All right, President Trump now says the war in Iran could end without Iran reaching any kind of deal and without opening the Strait of Hormuz. And also, he claimed that the United States has already achieved its top priority.
I had one goal. They will have no nuclear weapon. And that goal has been attained. They will not have nuclear weapons.
All right, that goal has already been achieved, he said. With us now, CNN national security analyst Alex Plitzis and David Sanger. David is White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. And as soon as President Trump said that, David, I thought of you and all the work you've done on Iran's nuclear capability and whether or not it's gone. And then sure enough, within like 20 minutes, you had posted an article in the New York Times. So how true is the statement that the president is saying the United States has achieved all its goals in regards to Iran's nuclear program?
There's not a lot that is true about this one, John. The president, if he left now, and if nothing changed in the next few weeks before he left, and he said he would be out in 2 weeks or so, Iran would still be left with its stockpile of near bomb grade enriched uranium. That's about 970 pounds, most of it buried under a mountain in Isfahan. And as we've discussed before, an operation to go and retrieve it and a commando raid would be enormously risky. But if it stays there, there's a risk as well, which is that Iran could build some underground centrifuges, bring it up to bomb grade, and we're right back to where we were before this attack happened. And you'll remember that on February 28th, the president said this was the major issue that led him to conduct the attack.
Alex, again, just expand a little bit on what David was talking about. Where is this nuclear material, and what would the military operation be to get it if the president so chooses, if he doesn't just say we're done tonight?
Well, David's laid it out in a number of his articles 100% correctly. Out of the total of about 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, there's an expectation that at least 220 of it is here under the facility at Isfahan. It's a deep buried facility. It was hit during Operation Midnight Hammer, but given the depth, the highly enriched uranium gas wasn't destroyed. So it's expected that it's stored in tubes underneath. The facility is about 300 miles inland. It's surrounded by mountains, 15 kilometers outside the third largest city inside of Iran. Multiple avenues of approach. So if you were to try to go in there and do something, it would be an incredibly risky mission, as David laid out.
All right, then I want to also talk about one other marker the president, I suppose, has removed, not laid down. It's the opposite of laying down, saying that this war could end and the United States would not really do anything to open the Strait of Hormuz. The strait effectively closed by Iran over the course of this conflict, not much shipping passing through. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's basically closed due to risk at this point. Shippers are not moving their ships through voluntarily. They're not closed due to mines, but from an economic perspective, the outcome is the same in terms of driving up cost, which was Iran's strategy in the first place. So the Pentagon had laid out objectives in the beginning of the war, which was to take out the drones, the missiles, the associated industrial base, sinking of the Navy, and then there was this open question about the nuclear program. The straits are what I'd call mission creep, because the Iranians add this as an objective afterwards. The U.S. gets very little oil out of the Gulf at this point, and the president then reached out to allies very publicly and forcefully and said, hey, we want your help doing this. The allies said no, and he's become a little blatantly angry in the last few days and said, you know what, it's your problem to deal with. So it's entirely possible. He says, look, we've hit 13,000 targets. We have 3,000 left to achieve those objectives. And you know what? The straits are somebody else's problem.
Somebody else's problem. You said he's angry. How angry? Very, David, because now the president this morning is saying that removing the United States from NATO, leaving NATO is, his words were, beyond reconsideration. I feel like that may be a few negatives there. But he's considering leaving NATO. He's floating that notion. This is something you've been talking about, and this is, of course, all the NATO nations here in blue. You've been talking to him about NATO for what, more than 10 years now. So how do you take these new threats this morning?
Well, I think he could very well do it. He is angry. He, of course, did not bring the NATO nations into the decision-making on going to war. Most of the European nations believe it was an illegal war. That is to say, it wasn't prompted by an imminent threat, and some of them have denied him use of their airspace, at least to conduct offensive operations. Spain among them, but not the only one. There are restrictions even from Britain. But I think that the key thing to think about today, John, is imagine that you're Vladimir Putin and you woke up to read this interview and this news. What has Donald Trump done in the past week? First, he has brought about a conflict that raised the price of oil and thus got Putin and Russia out of its economic fix, or at least gave them a pathway out. And now, if he pulls out of NATO, he will have helped Russia accomplish what has been Putin's greatest goal for the past quarter century, which is to split up NATO. And I couldn't imagine something that played more to the Russian strategy than high oil prices and a splintered NATO.
Yeah, look, I don't mean to be glib here, but this is Vladimir Putin in Russia right now, and he's smiling at this discussion. David Sanger, Alex Plitzis, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. Sarah?